October, 1886. The air in Deadwood already carried the sharp bite of an early winter. The peaks of the Black Hills shimmered gold in the late sun, but somewhere in that dry wind, snow was waiting, ready to pounce. At the small wooden train station, the screech of iron wheels on rails cut through the quiet like a blade. The train hissed to a halt, white steam billowing around it like a weary beast. Anna Margrethe Olsdatter, 23, stepped down onto the platform. Her gray wool dress was worn thin, her leather boots scuffed, her only possessions a soft, weathered satchel and a crumpled letter. Her passage had cost exactly $200, paid in advance by William Hartley through a mail-order bride agency. But 3 days later, when the worst blizzard in memory buried Deadwood under nearly 10 feet of snow, the townsfolk would learn. Anna's worth could never be measured in dollars. They had stared at her that day, whispering, "The purchased bride." Foreign. Doesn't even speak proper English. They huddled together in Mayfield's general store, sneering when she stumbled over her words. They lowered their voices just enough to seem polite, but not enough that she couldn't hear them outside the church on Sunday mornings. American men, always falling for strange women. What they didn't know was that Anna carried Viking blood in her veins. Back home in Stavanger, Norway, winters far harsher than this one had forged her spirit. Her family line had survived blizzards and wolves, and long, sunless nights that would break softer souls. They thought William Hartley was buying himself a meek Norwegian wife, someone to cook, clean, and keep her head down. They had no idea he'd brought home a descendant of seafarers who had conquered storms and ice long before Montana was even mapped, and in just a few days, that bloodline would save every single one of them. The train groaned and pulled away, leaving Anna alone on the dusty platform, her presence now the center of every curious, suspicious gaze. The evening light spilled scarlet over the far ridges of the Black Hills, a warning that winter was coming. Anna drew in a deep breath of cutting air and gripped her satchel tighter. This was her new land, and she was ready. The train's final whistle split the crisp October air, sharp and shrill. The massive black iron engine groaned and hissed like a weary beast as it slowed to a stop. White steam billowed across the tiny wooden platform, swallowing everything in a cloud of heat and noise. Anna Margrethe Olsdatter stood slightly apart from the others, clutching a soft leather satchel in one hand and a crumpled letter in the other. She had read those words so many times they were etched into her memory. William Hartley, Deadwood, Dakota Territory. Arrangements agreed. Wedding to follow upon arrival. The platform buzzed with the usual commotion of a frontier town. Children darted between the planks, their laughter sharp in the cold. Miners grunted as they loaded supplies onto wagons. An old woman, half hidden behind a post, narrowed her eyes at Anna, taking in her pale braid, her foreign features. And there he was, standing apart from the crowd, hat in hand, looking at her as though unsure if he wanted what he'd paid for. William Hartley. He was taller than most of the men around him, his shoulders broad and hands weathered from ranch work, but something in the way he shifted his weight betrayed uncertainty. Anna's first thought was that he was older than his letters had made her imagine. Her second was that the doubt in his gray eyes would make this arrangement even harder than she'd feared. "Miss Olsdatter," he called, his voice slow, carrying the plains in its drawl. She straightened her back. "Yes, Mr. Hartley," she answered carefully, her Norwegian accent shaping every word. The English she'd practiced in the cramped train compartment now felt heavy on her tongue. His eyes swept over her like a man judging livestock. Anna felt her cheeks burn, but kept her chin high. Back in Stavanger, she'd endured worse, creditors and fishermen who thought her father's debts gave them rights over her. "You're taller than I expected," he finally remarked. "I am," she replied evenly, her accent thickening slightly, "as God made me." Nearby, she caught the hiss of a voice. Mrs. Mayfield, the boarding house keeper William had mentioned in his letters, leaned toward her companion and murmured just loudly enough to carry, "Foreign. Probably doesn't even speak proper English." Anna's jaw tightened. She understood far more than they thought. William adjusted his hat, cleared his throat. "Well then," he muttered awkwardly, "let's get you settled." When he reached for her satchel, she instinctively pulled it close. "I can manage," she said flatly. He raised an eyebrow, then shrugged, muttering, "Suit yourself," and gestured toward a wagon hitched to 2 bays, waiting at the edge of the platform. "The ranch is about 8 miles out," he added as they walked. "We'll talk on the way." Anna could feel every pair of eyes following her. The whispers floated on the chilly evening air. "Came all the way from Norway. He paid good money for her. Poor thing. Doesn't know what she's in for. That last one almost made her stumble. Poor thing. Like some fragile little bird ripped from its nest. If only they knew. If only they knew what she'd already survived. Watching her family's fishing business collapse after her father's death, lying awake in a freezing attic counting coins that never added up to enough, making the bitter calculation that marrying a stranger in America was still better than starving at home. William helped her into the wagon stiffly, then climbed up beside her. The leather seat groaned under their weight, and the horses snorted, eager to move. At first, silence stretched between them. The steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead were the only sounds. "So," William finally said, his hands tight on the reins. "Everything. As agreed? The ticket. The advance." "Yes," Anna said shortly. She'd sold nearly everything she owned to cover the difference between what he'd sent and what the journey had actually cost. But that was her burden, not his. They rode on without speaking for a while. The land was alien. Rolling golden hills dotted with dark pine, the mountains looming in the distance like silent sentinels. Beautiful in its way, but nothing like the jagged fjords and rocky cliffs of her homeland. "Tell me about Norway," he said suddenly. Anna turned, startled. "What would you like to know?" "Anything. I've never been anywhere but Dakota and Wyoming." For the first time since stepping off the train, a faint warmth bloomed in her chest. "It is dramatic," she said slowly. "Mountains that dive straight into the sea. In winter the snow is so deep you must ski to reach your neighbors. Nights that last forever, days that never really begin." He glanced at her then, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "Sounds harsh." "It is," she said simply, "but it makes you strong." Then, almost to herself, "In Norway, soft people don't live long." William gave a dry grunt, his gaze still fixed ahead. "Winters aren't gentle here either." "I will manage," Anna murmured, her voice steady. Something in her tone made him look at her again, really look, and for just a second, she thought she saw respect flicker in his gray eyes. The wagon climbed higher through the pines, and the valley opened below them. Golden grass, dark forest, a large house nestled into the hillside like it belonged there. William nodded toward it. "Hartley Ranch. Been in my family 20 years. Anna studied it. The 2-story house with its wide porch, the barns and corrals, the cattle grazing below. "It's beautiful," she said softly. His shoulders eased just a little. "Costs plenty to keep it that way," he said. "Costs more every year." And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. This marriage, like her journey, was not about romance. It was about survival, for both of them. and somehow knowing that made everything feel a little easier. 3 days later, Deadwood woke to a gray, wind-whipped morning. The chill cut through the dusty streets, rattling fences and creaking the wooden sign above the little stone church. On the steps outside, townsfolk gathered, their black coats swaying in the gusts, eager to watch what they'd been whispering about all week. Inside the small sanctuary, candles flickered faintly against the cold. Anna stood still, clutching a bouquet of white daisies that trembled in her hands. She wore her mother's deep blue wool dress, worn at the seams but the finest she owned. Beside her stood William Hartley, stiff and straight-backed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes stared ahead, distant and detached, as though waiting for the preacher to finish reciting a business agreement. Reverend Alden's dry voice rose in the hushed space. "William Hartley, do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold?" "I do," William replied, steady but cold, as if reading from a ledger. Then the preacher turned to her. He hesitated, glancing at the faded paper in his hand. "Anna. Margrethe Ols?" She spoke up clearly, her Norwegian accent rolling through the silence like a distant wave. "Anna Margrethe Olsdatter." The preacher nodded slightly, then continued. "And do you take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" Anna paused. The moment stretched, the air in the church heavy, almost alive. In her mind, she heard her grandmother's voice from Stavanger. "Sometimes, child, you have to step into the wolf's den to find your way to safety." She lifted her chin and said, "I do." The kiss that sealed their vows was brief and perfunctory, just long enough to satisfy the formality, without warmth or promise. When they turned to face the pews, Anna caught the stares, curious, judgmental, pitying, and some, the worst of all, entertained. Mrs. Mayfield sat in the front row, her mouth pursed disapprovingly. Behind her, Mrs. Davidson leaned toward a friend, whispering into her glove, and the two women stifled laughter. Only Martha Cole, the German housekeeper, smiled at Anna, a kind, genuine smile that felt like a lifeline in a sea of ice. The reception, if it could be called that, was held in the church's back room. Someone brought in a small cake and a pot of black coffee that smelled like it had boiled since dawn. Anna stood beside William, accepting congratulations that sounded more like condolences. Men made jokes about imports and international commerce, laughing behind their hands as they sipped from chipped cups. Davidson, the self-appointed mayor of Deadwood, approached, his words dripping with patronizing charm. "Hope you'll find our American ways agreeable, Mrs. Hartley," he said, "though I imagine anything's better than all that snow and ice you're used to." Anna's fingers tightened around her cup. "Norway is beautiful," she said, her words deliberate, each one a pebble thrown into his smug smile. "And I am proud of where I come from." Davidson raised his eyebrows slightly, as if pride itself were somehow inappropriate. Of course, but now you're American, or at least you will be once you learn how to live properly here." The implication hung there, sharp as a knife. Her ways, her heritage, even her very self, things to be discarded like an old coat. William said nothing. That evening, back at the ranch, Anna lay alone in the small room Martha had prepared. Through the thin walls, she could hear William moving about his own room, his steps heavy, his silence louder than any words. She didn't need him to say it outright. She already knew this was no marriage of love. She stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, listening to the sounds of her new life, the wind whistling through the eaves, the wood groaning in the cold, the lowing of cattle in the distance. so different from Stavanger, where the sea slammed against rocks, where gulls cried above the fishing boats, where familiar voices had once called her by name. Here she was a stranger, a purchased bride, a curiosity for others to watch and whisper about. She closed her eyes, whispering silently to herself. I've weathered worse storms than these. They don't know. They don't know anything. Outside her window, snowflakes had begun to fall, small, silent, and glittering under the pale moonlight, a promise of the brutal winter to come. The first days of marriage to William Hartley passed in a cold fog and in the weight of watching eyes. Anna rose early, throwing herself into the rhythms of ranch life as though she'd always belonged here. She learned to milk the cows, though old Hans, the senior ranch hand, would shake his head and mutter each time she fumbled. She cooked alongside Martha, improvising Norwegian recipes with American ingredients, to mixed reviews from the men at the table. But her real trials didn't come from the kitchen or the barn. They came from town. Every Saturday, William hitched the wagon and took her with him into Deadwood for supplies. And every Saturday, she felt herself shrinking under the gaze of the townsfolk. The moment she stepped into Mayfield's general store, the chatter always stopped. Conversations dropped to whispers loud enough to hear. Doesn't even speak proper English, so I've heard. Fisherman's daughter, dirt poor. Paid good money for damaged goods, if you ask me. She pretended not to notice. But her hand tightened on the bolt of blue linen she was examining, her nails digging into the fabric. A voice, syrupy and sharp, cut through behind her. Mrs. Hartley, said Mrs. Mayfield, her smile polite and predatory. I do hope you don't mind a bit of advice. That accent of yours? It's awfully thick. American men prefer their wives to sound, well, American. Anna didn't look up, her hand still on the cloth. Her voice was steady when she replied. My husband has not complained. Oh, I'm sure William's too much of a gentleman to say anything, but men talk. They're all wondering if you'll ever really fit in. The words hit their mark, sharp and humiliating. Anna felt her cheeks warm, her chest tighten. And then another voice spoke up, deep and gravelly, from the back of the store. Seems to me, it said, a woman who travels 3,000 miles to build a life doesn't need lessons in how to fit in. Both women turned. Standing there, leaning on his cane, was Einar Gundersen, the Norwegian mill owner who'd been in Deadwood longer than anyone. His face was worn and dusted with sawmill ash, but his eyes still burned with quiet defiance. Mr. Gundersen, Mrs. Mayfield huffed, I was only trying to help. Then help yourself to some manners, he shot back. He turned to Anna, and, in their shared mother tongue, said warmly, Don't pay her any mind. Just an old crow jealous of youth. Anna almost smiled, despite herself. She replied softly, also in Norwegian. Thank you. It's good to hear my own language again. Mrs. Mayfield flushed scarlet at being shut out of the conversation. You'll see, girl, she hissed as she turned away. We don't take kindly to those who don't know their place. Anna didn't answer, but she held Einar's gaze a moment longer and nodded her thanks. He touched the brim of his hat and limped out. That evening, Anna sat on the front steps of the ranch house, hugging her knees against the chill, watching the black hills burn red in the sunset. Martha bustled somewhere inside. William was still out in the yard somewhere, checking fences. The words still echoed in her head. You'll never fit in. Back in Stavanger, she'd been known, seen, called by name. Here she was just an object, bought and bargained for, discussed like cattle. She barely noticed when William's boots crunched on the boards behind her. He hesitated, then sat down beside her on the step. Heard there was some trouble in town, he said, voice quiet, neutral. Anna gave a small, bitter laugh. Word travels fast. Small town, everything travels fast, he murmured. After a pause, he added, What did Gunderson say to you? Anna turned her head, her gaze cool, but her tone soft. He said not to listen to her, that she's just a bitter old woman. William let out a dry huff, not quite a laugh, but close. Sounds about right. What did you say back? I thanked him, told him it was good to hear my own language again. He was quiet for a moment, then said almost thoughtfully, Must be hard, being the only one who speaks it. It was the first time since her arrival that he'd really looked at her, seen her. Anna nodded faintly. We have a saying, back home. A foreign bird doesn't sing. Now, I understand it. William turned to her, his eyes holding hers for the first time. Maybe the problem isn't the bird, he said slowly. Maybe it's that the other birds don't bother listening. Anna blinked at him, startled, but before she could find a reply, the sound of hooves thundered from the dark. A horse skidded to a halt in the yard, foam spraying from its flanks. Jimmy Collins, the youngest ranch hand, swung down, breathless. Boss, he gasped, you need to come quick. Something bad up in the north pasture. William was already on his feet, his tone sharp. What kind of bad? Jimmy swallowed. 3 head of cattle dead, not from sickness, torn apart. I've never seen... He glanced at Anna, hesitated. Say it, William ordered. Jimmy blurted. Tracks. Big ones. Nothing I recognize. William cursed under his breath and headed for the barn. Saddle the horses. We ride first thing tomorrow. Anna rose, her voice cutting through the evening. If the predators already come this close, it won't stop at cattle. In Norway, when wolves come down from the mountains, it means they're desperate, and desperate means bold. Jimmy met her eyes and nodded slowly. She's right, he said. My grandmother used to say the same. Animals know when storms are coming. William froze, staring at her under the growing dusk. You think this is weather? He asked. Anna met his gaze. I think the animals know what we don't. Back home, we watch the birds to read the sea. When they change, it means something's coming. Almost on cue, a cold gust swept through the yard, carrying the scent of snow and something wilder, more primal. The horses in the corral stomped and snorted nervously. William's jaw tightened as he looked up at the gathering clouds. Jimmy, he called, double the watch tonight and keep everyone armed. Yes, sir. Jimmy ran back toward the bunkhouse. William and Anna stood together on the porch, saying nothing. But both of them felt it now, a shift in the air, an unease settling into the bones of the ranch. Whatever was coming would not be like any winter they'd seen before. That night, the wind carried with it the scent of snow, arriving sooner than anyone had expected. Heavy clouds gathered over the black hills, dark and leaden, casting a shadow over the valley and the brittle golden grass that seemed to shiver under the weight of the coming cold. The Hartley ranch fell unusually quiet, save for the faint clatter of loose shutters and the occasional uneasy low of cattle out in the dark. When William returned from the north pasture, his face was grim, his mouth tight, his eyes heavy with thought. He strode into the kitchen, brushed the snow from his shoulders, and summoned Jimmy and the other hands into the main room. They huddled around the table as he recounted what he'd seen. 3 head of cattle dead, bodies torn open, the snow around them stained dark, and tracks, large, deep, unfamiliar, pressed into the frozen mud. No one could say what animal had left them, but everyone understood it was no ordinary wolf. Anna lingered in the doorway, unnoticed, but she had already heard enough. Deep in her bones, she felt that strange chill her grandmother had called the wolf's breath. Nights like this had come to Stavanger too, quiet at first. Then the wolves came down from the mountains, the snow fell, and the wind screamed like the howl of starving beasts. And after that, only the prepared survived. She turned to the window, watching the clouds sag lower, the sky blackening as though a curtain were falling. That night, the wind changed direction, sharp and cutting, slipping through the smallest cracks, rattling every door. In the corral, the horses stomped and snorted, their unease growing. At supper, no one spoke much. William hardly touched his food, glancing now and then toward the windows, listening to something only he seemed to hear. Finally, he rose, told Jimmy and Hans to ready rifles, and ordered them to keep watch through the night. The men only nodded, silent. When they dispersed, Anna remained by the window, one hand pressed against the icy glass, her eyes fixed on the whirling flakes outside. She knew what those signs meant. The storm was coming. Not just a winter storm, but the kind of storm her people called Ulvewinter, the wolf winter, the kind that tested who deserved to see spring. Before leaving the room, William stopped and glanced at her where she stood, as if he wanted to ask something but thought better of it. He only muttered, almost to himself, "Sky doesn't look like other years." And then he was gone. That night, as the wind howled harder, shaking the walls, strange noises echoed from somewhere beyond the north fields. Anna did not sleep. She sat at the edge of her bed, her gaze steady in the dark, her fingers finding their way into her small cloth pouch, pulling out the little carved Viking ship her father had made. She closed her hand around it, whispering a prayer in Norwegian, not so much a plea as a promise to herself. "I carry the blood of those who conquered the sea. I will not flinch before the wolf's winter." Outside, the snow began to whip across the porch in earnest. The storm, at last, had arrived. By morning, the world had vanished. When Anna woke, her room was already dim, with the gray glow of snow clinging to the window. She stepped into the hallway, where the wind moaned through the cracks, and the wooden beams creaked under the cold. Outside, the ranch was swallowed by white. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in sheets that lashed the house like sand, and the wind howled like wolves at the door. William was already awake, standing in the kitchen, a cold cup of coffee in his hands, staring out the window. When Anna joined him, he murmured without turning, "I've never seen it come down this fast." Beyond the glass, the front yard, just a few paces from the porch, was already a solid wall of white. The wind screamed, hurling ice against the shutters with a fury that made the horses in the corral stamp and whinny in terror. By midday, the snow had risen almost to the window sills. The barn roof was half buried. The sky hung heavy, dark as iron, pressing down on the hills like a threat. No one spoke. No one dared go outside. The hired hands gathered in the main room, bundled in blankets and coats, rifles leaning within reach. They sat in silence, their faces pale in the glow of the fire. Jimmy sat closest to the hearth, knees drawn to his chest, glancing now and then at the windows where the storm raged. Anna sat apart, calmer than they expected. She'd known it was coming. She just hadn't expected it so soon, or so fierce. Every scream of the wind outside reminded her of nights in Stavanger, of waves crashing over rooftops, of children huddled next to their grandmother in the stone cellar. Martha bustled in and out, carrying wood and water, whispering to no one in particular. "The stove will last another day, maybe. If it keeps like this, we'll have to close off rooms and save the heat." William didn't answer. He stood at the window, jaw tight, watching the white world beyond. Only the roar of the wind answered him, throwing gusts at the glass so hard it rattled in the frame. By late afternoon, the wind had grown wilder still. The entire yard was now a pit of snow, the outbuildings barely visible, roofs buried, fences gone. A sharp crack came from the direction of the barn, followed by the panicked screams of horses. And then silence. Anna turned her head toward William. He looked back at her. In that moment, neither of them said a word, but both understood. This was no ordinary winter. This was a wolf's winter. As night fell, the wind began to change pitch, rising and falling in long, mournful wails. Snow now struck the roof like stones. The windows were dark, except where the flames of the fire flickered faintly on the glass. Around her, the men stared into the glow, shoulders hunched, lips pressed thin. Anna sat by the fire, her fingers wrapped around the little wooden ship she kept in her pocket. Quietly, in her heart, she summoned the pride she'd carried from home. She wasn't afraid. Not of this. She had seen worse storms, survived longer nights, and now, while everyone else here trembled and bent under the weight of the wind, she knew. Tonight, it would fall to her to decide who would live to see the dawn. Outside, the sky roared, and the fight with winter had only just begun. That night, someone knocked at the door. At first, they thought it was only the wind rattling the shutters, a branch scraping against the siding, the mindless sounds of a storm gone mad outside. But then it came again. Slow, heavy, desperate. A knock, unmistakable, steady in its plea. William stiffened, glancing at the ranch hands huddled by the fire. No one moved. Out there was a wall of white so thick a man could freeze to death in just a few steps. He looked at Anna. She sat calm as ever, her hand wrapped around the little wooden ship in her pocket, her eyes steady. Her voice was low but clear. "If you open that door without tying yourself off, you won't find your way back. The wind will swallow you." William hesitated just a second, then nodded. He stepped into the storeroom, returned with a coil of rope, and tied it tight around his waist, securing it to the door handle. The room fell silent as he opened the door. The wind howled in like a living thing, flinging snow into the room, stinging their cheeks, snuffing the fire low. William vanished into the white, the rope snaking after him, taut and trembling with each gust. 5 steps. 10. His voice faint against the roar. "Where are you?" A weak cry answered, "Help! Here!" When he returned, dragging 2 collapsed shapes through the doorway, everyone rushed to pull them inside. It was the Patterson family, the blacksmith, his wife, and their infant son, their bodies stiff and glazed with ice, the baby nearly blue. Anna didn't hesitate. She took the baby from the mother's numb arms and pressed it against her own body for warmth. "Blankets," she ordered. "Warm water. Don't put him too close to the fire, or his body will go into shock." Her tone was sharp, practiced, the voice of someone who'd done this before. It reminded her of her grandmother's stern commands in Stavanger when the fishing boats overturned and men were pulled from the sea half dead. The knocking didn't stop. All through the night, more came. Another family, an old man, a boy who had lost his way. By dawn, 14 people were crammed into the main room. The air smelled of wet wool, smoke, and fear, cut only by the sound of crying children and the storm's endless scream outside. They all pressed close around the fire, clinging to what little heat there was, but one by one their eyes turned to Anna. And what she saw in those eyes was no longer suspicion, no longer mockery, but something softer, grateful, trusting. When morning came, a gray light bled through the windows, but the storm did not stop. Snow was piled to the second-story windows now, the wind still clawing at the house. But inside, under the wavering firelight, people began to breathe a little easier. Their eyes met hers differently now. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. It was her calm, her commands, her presence that had kept them alive through the night. She met their gaze, her own softening, and in her heart she promised, "We'll make it. No matter how loud the wolves howl, no one will die tonight." Outside, the storm still roared. But for the first time all night, their hearts beat steady again, and they all understood it was because of her. On the second night of the storm, the wind changed its voice. It no longer wailed in long, mournful howls, but broke into sharp, slicing gusts like knives through flesh. The snow eased, but what it left behind was a world buried to the eaves in white. Anna stayed awake, sitting near the frosted window in the main room, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Outside was nothing but a swirling gray void, lit faintly by a veiled moon. And then she heard it. The first howl cut through the storm like a blade, distant yet piercing, cold enough to make every man in the room glance up in silence. Not one animal, but many. A pack. Their song rose and fell, echoing off the hills in a hunting chorus of hunger. Anna rose to her feet, walking slowly to the glass, leaning close. In the faint moonlight she could see them, dark shapes gliding across the snow, low and deliberate. She narrowed her eyes and counted. More than 24, long, lean bodies moving as one, cutting black streaks across the white. William came to stand beside her, silent. His eyes followed hers into the yard, where the wolves were gathering like spilled ink on paper. When he finally saw their number, his breath slowed, fogging the window. "Dear God," he murmured. Anna didn't answer. Her gaze stayed hard, steady, watching the way the pack split into smaller groups, circling the edges of fences, testing for weakness, already thinking like predators. Behind them, the ranch hands stood motionless, staring out into the night, their jaws tight. Martha clutched the Patterson baby to her chest, her lips moving in a quiet prayer. "They won't come here," Anna said softly, still watching. "This house has enough heat, enough people. They know this is a den, but out there—" Her mind drifted to the smaller homes scattered through town, the elderly living alone, the children sleeping in cold attics. No fire strong enough, no bullets enough. They wouldn't stand a chance. William stayed quiet for a long moment, then spoke, his voice dropping. "We need to warn them." Anna nodded. "We do." Jimmy spoke up from the corner, nervous. "But how? The roads are gone. Snow's up to your chest in places." Anna drew a slow breath and turned to them. Her face was calm, her eyes lit with something ancient, the kind of fire you only see in someone who has already faced storms at sea and refused to bow. "In Norway," she said evenly, "when storms bury a village and wolves come down from the mountains, we light signal fires on the roofs. High enough, dark enough, thick enough, so the rest know to wake and save themselves. Tonight, we do the same." The room fell silent. Someone inhaled sharply. William turned to Jimmy. "Rope, green wood, wool blankets, whatever we can spare. We're going up." Jimmy hesitated only a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Anna turned back to the window, her gaze fixed on the wolves as they fanned out across the snow, dark shadows curling and slithering at the edges of town, searching for the softest place to strike. And under her breath, barely audible, she whispered, "Tonight we make the wolves fear the fire of men." Outside, the wind screamed, carrying with it the growls and cries of the hunters gathering at the doorsteps of the town. But in Anna's eyes now, it wasn't the storm that mattered anymore. The wolves had come, and tonight she would make them retreat. On the roof, the wind screamed like a wild animal. Anna was the first to climb up. The rope was tied tight around her waist, anchored to a hook below the eaves in case she slipped. The shingles were slick with ice, each gust sharp enough to cut the breath from her lungs. But she didn't stop. She knew this wind. It was just another version, harsher, perhaps, of the fjord cliffs she'd once scaled as a girl. Jimmy and William followed, hauling bundles of green wood, old wool blankets, and coils of oil-soaked rope. The dim yellow glow of the house below lit their faces just enough to show the tension in their jaws, the white clouds of their breath. Once they were all on the roof, Anna motioned for them to crouch low against the gusts. She pointed to the highest point. "There," she said, her voice steady, carrying even through the storm's roar. They worked quickly, following her instructions. The green wood was stacked into a tight cone, with tufts of wool stuffed between the logs to produce thick smoke. Dry straw was packed at the base to catch the flame. William glanced at the strange arrangement, doubt flickering in his eyes. But when Anna struck flint to tinder and the first bright flame took hold, crawling through the straw, licking up the wood, catching on the wool, the doubt disappeared. The fire rose faster than he expected, burning hot and high, coughing black smoke into the dark sky. The smoke didn't climb upward, but stretched sideways, heavy and thick, carried on the wind like a black ribbon scrawled across the white world. Anna stood in the center of the roof, her hair torn loose by the wind, her cloak snapping like wings, her eyes fixed on the distant town. And then she saw it. Another column of smoke, faint at first, curling up from the Patterson house in town. Then another, from the coal rooftop. Then another, and another. The people had seen. They understood. And one by one, they lit their own signal fires, answering her call with their own. William followed her gaze, watching the lights appear. For the first time, he lowered his head and nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of something he hadn't wanted to admit before. In his eyes now was something Anna had never seen there, respect. But Anna didn't smile. Her eyes stayed on the yard below, where the wolves had gathered. Their glowing eyes still burned yellow in the dark, their long black shapes frozen now, no longer advancing. They weren't gone, not yet. But tonight, the fire of humans had reminded them this place would not fall easily. A strong gust tore across the roof, snapping branches somewhere below. Jimmy clutched at the edge of the shingles to steady himself. William crouched low to keep from being blown back. But Anna stood firm, her hand gripping the rope, her eyes locked on that vast, endless white. The storm still raged. The howls still rose from the hills. But tonight, for the first time, it was the wolves that hesitated. And tonight, they would learn to fear. The dawn of the fourth day came quietly, without fanfare. After 3 nights of howling winds and blinding snow, the sky finally softened, turning a pale silver that stretched across the horizon like a long scar. The air was so sharp and clear it felt heavy with each breath, and the world lay in a strange silence, the kind of silence that follows a battle when the field lies still and broken under the morning light. Anna woke first. She rose carefully, stepping around the bodies of those still sleeping in the main room. Children curled in their mothers' arms, men slumped with rifles still in their hands, Martha dozing in a chair by the embers of the fire. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. What lay before her was another world. Snow had swallowed everything, piled so high it reached the second story, The barn was nothing but a sharp peak jutting from the drifts. Fences were gone. Trees lay broken and black against the white. Yet in the faint sunlight, it was all painted pink and gold, a quiet, breathtaking kind of beauty. Far off in the fields, the wolves were gone. Only their tracks remained, long, looping trails through the snow, retreating into the hills. William joined her, his coat pulled tight around his shoulders, his eyes scanning the same horizon. Their breaths mingled in the cold air before disappearing into nothing. "It's over," he said quietly. But his eyes moved over the ruins, the collapsed roofs, the smokeless chimneys in the distance, the places where no one yet knew if anyone was left alive. And he asked, "What's left?" Anna didn't answer at first. Her gaze stayed on the thin columns of smoke still rising from town, signs of homes where the fire hadn't gone out. Finally, she said softly, "Us. We're alive. That's enough." That day, the people of Deadwood came out of hiding, blinking into the light like survivors climbing from a cave. They clung to each other, some crying openly, others just staring at what the storm had done. Anna led them, organizing small groups to check every house and cellar. They dug out children trapped in woodpiles, found old men shivering in collapsed roofs, pulled families from the snow where no one thought they'd survived. By afternoon, the first birds returned, gliding low over the hills. People began stamping down paths through the drifts, hacking open doors, coaxing life back into what was left. When it was over, William came to her. He stood before her for a long moment, then finally said, "When I sent the money, I thought I was buying a wife. But now I know, nothing I paid for could ever equal what you've given this place." Anna met his eyes. He went on, his voice low, almost hesitant, not from the cold, but something deeper. "If you'll have me, I'd like to start over. Not as a transaction, but as something real. Will you stay?" Anna didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted back to the sky, to the faint smoke ribbons still hanging over the rooftops like threads. She thought of the harbors of Stavanger, the cry of gulls, the crash of waves. And then she looked back at him, and she smiled. "I'll stay." That evening, Deadwood felt different. In the warm light of the fire, people who had once whispered about the purchased bride came forward to take her hand and call her their rescuer. The eyes that had once mocked her now dropped with quiet respect. Anna stood beside William on the porch, watching the distant mountains fade into night, feeling the last winter wind brush past her. And she knew her story wasn't over yet. The storm had passed, but its lesson would remain forever. The lesson that the strongest souls often come from where no one expects them, and that sometimes the most precious things can never be bought.